I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Saurabh Sharma.
I'm Inez.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm actually going to kick us off today with the Democratic debate taking place intra-party about whether or not Biden should debate his likely challenger, former President Donald Trump. Saurabh will take us through the credentialed class's revenge on Bill Ackman for going after former Harvard President Claudine Gay. Ben is going to talk about the latest deep state attack on its own government investigators. And then Inez will close us out with the latest saga involving the William Penn statue. So without further ado, the Democrats are trying to work through whether or not Biden should participate in the normal presidential debate process against Donald Trump, who is likely to win the GOP primary and be his challenger in the 2024 general election. And The Hill ran a pretty fascinating piece this week, walking through some of the Democratic objections to Biden participating in the debates. The main criticism is that they believe that Biden sharing a stage with Trump would grant him unearned legitimacy. So Dick Durbin, who is the Democratic whip in the Senate, said, quote, "I would think twice about it. I've been physically present at one of Trump's debates with Hillary Clinton, and I watched him do outrageous things and say outrageous things. It's just an opportunity to display his extremism." And another critic of the Democratic debate process was, I believe it was another Democratic senator. I can't quite find his name right now. Chris Coons, here we go. He said, "I was in the room for one of the debates in 2020. Chris Wallace was the moderator. The former president in no way at all respected the rules or the tradition or decorum of presidential debates. Quote, it was a disaster." And this lines up pretty well with the new Biden administration or Biden campaign strategy, that is, of painting Trump as a dictator who's not even fit to be running for president. They've been pretty tacitly supporting the moves to remove Trump from the ballot in several states. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Biden is actually entertaining this idea of eschewing the debates under the premise that it would allow Trump legitimacy, as the Biden campaign says that he's a dictator, he's an authoritarian, and a threat to democracy. But what's, I think, the quite obvious tell here that this is not really about Trump is that privately, Democrats are telling the media that they are worried about Biden debating because of his obvious issues with his cognitive ability. So this is a convenient cover, a convenient excuse. Biden doesn't want to get on the debate stage because all Trump has to do is appear semi-competent and he'll likely outperform Biden. Now, on the flip side, if Biden is able to string sentences together, then perhaps he could be seen as having a good debate performance because the bar is already set so low for him. And that might be what these Democrats are doing here too, is setting the bar extraordinarily low so that Biden doesn't have to do much to really clear it. The only Democratic strategist who publicly has toyed with the idea of Biden actually participating is James Carville, who notes that the negatives of Biden not appearing are probably far outweighing the positives of him not appearing. And primarily due to the fact that there are so many voter questions about Biden's age, about his mental acuity, that not participating in the debate would essentially be an admission that he's not up to the task and that he's not capable of going through a multi-hour process with having to defend his record, particularly against someone as boisterous and aggressive as the former president. So I will go ahead with that and kick it over to the group and see if you all think that Biden will actually end up debating Trump in the general election in this coming cycle. Trump, of course, has said that he would like to have 10 debates with Biden if possible, but seems like we might not get any.
I think that this is very similar to last time around when the Biden campaign was able to set broader expectations so low that when a week or a month came along where President Biden was hopped up on a cocktail of drugs strong enough to keep him basically stable during a debate. It was the most impressive thing ever. And people were like, my goodness, he's still got it. Uncle Joe can deliver us the promised land. And so I would just urge people who are taking a victory lap on this stuff, or taking solace in this public perception of Biden's health, to realize that it can be a double-edged sword, and it could easily backfire if, for whatever reason, as we get closer to election day, he finds his juice. I mean, he certainly was pretty high energy at his January 6th speech. I mean, he was stumbling like he usually does, but it could have been a lot worse. So this is part of my broader criticism of a form of cope that the right has, that, somehow Biden's not going to be on the ballot, his senility is going to stop him. I just don't think any of that's true. And so I think that he might well end up debating, and he might well end up impressing.
So I mean, that's a good rejoinder, I guess, to not sort of oversell the senility argument. I mean, there is a general, since 2020, debates have become optional for a lot of candidates, and Trump himself has participated in that by not debating his primary opponents thus far, right? So, but we saw it in the Arizona governor's race. We've seen it periodically in other races. I mean, I guess I'm of two minds as to how much this matters. On the one hand, we have so many sending a horse to the Senate kind of moments in American politics in the last several years, that this doesn't seem to be the type of thing that should raise to the top of our sort of civic concerns right now. And particularly with both Biden and Trump both having been president before, the utility of a debate and what they're going to say really may not be as important as it would be for candidates who have not taken that office before. That being said, I mean, I do think that it's a bad thing that the American people, debates have been very revelatory in past elections. I think they are a very useful tool, if not completely ruined by the moderation, which is a whole different topic. But I do think it's fundamentally a good thing for voters to be able to hear on the fly, live, the two candidates who want to be their president speak to each other. And in that sense, I do think this is a bad and yet another negative trend in American politics and American democracy. That being said, I don't think there's going to be a debate. I don't think that there's just too ample excuse now for the Biden camp not to. And maybe they're playing the 4D chess Saurabh is suggesting, where if Biden can string 3 sentences together on a debate stage, it actually helps him. But even that, the upside seems pretty small. If I were advising Biden, I wouldn't advise him to debate. Because if he does stumble on stage, it will confirm what everybody thinks, that Biden is too old to do the job. And Trump has been very successful in not all, but the majority of his debate performances. And he's very funny. It's a strength of his. So I wouldn't advise, if I were one of Biden's advisors, I wouldn't advise him to do this. I just worry how often that's going to be the case. Just like if I were Trump's advisor in the primary, I would also not advise him to debate. All he could do, being so far ahead, is slip up in some way that hurts him, right? So I wonder how many more times, or how much more common it is for anyone who's advising a given candidate and that candidate's interest to say, nope, just skip it. It's not that big a deal anymore in the internet 24-hour news cycle age. It's not that important.
I think the challenge in the kind of upside downside analysis, if we take this reporting at face value and don't assume that it's cynical and the politics behind it for a second, is, on the one hand, I'm not sure that it would wash with the American people that someone wants to be the president of the United States for another term and he won't stand on stage with a chief competitor. For whatever the, potential gain would be of not platforming Donald Trump and basically continuing an effective political gag order against him in defense of our democracy, in air quotes. By the same token, maybe the biggest liability beyond the substance of Joe Biden's policies is the idea that he is not going to be fit for 4 more years, or even a fraction of those 4 more years. So if he can't stand on stage and exhibit a baseline level of energy, let alone acuity, to stand toe-to-toe with someone who is comparatively very vigorous, given his age comparatively, then, I just don't see it washing. Now, is this about expectation setting? I think that is certainly a possibility. I also might cabin this or put this under the same kind of theme of whispering campaigns against Joe Biden, or that essentially call into question or highlight Joe Biden's apparent deficiencies that actually do really concern Democrats. And we've seen a lot of that sort of whispering campaign coming in particular from Barack Obama's camp, which I always hold to be more significant than any other, typical talking heads on corporate media channels. So to me, maybe the catch-all way to think about this particular line of argumentation or this particular issue is that this is part of a hedging exercise. And the hedging exercise is, will Joe Biden be the nominee or will Joe Biden not be the nominee? If he is, in fact, the nominee, will he actually go through legitimately campaigning, and will he actually go toe-to-toe with the actual competitor on the other side? I continue to believe, quite frankly, that Democrats are reserving the right to make him the nominee and then pull the plug on him subsequent to the convention. I know that's, or during the convention. And obviously, you can call that conspiratorial, but we've never necessarily been in a position like this with the kind of figure that he is in a campaign of the nature of this one. So I think Democrats keep all of their options open, and floating out right now as a trial balloon the notion of should he debate or should he not debate, I think plays into that same sort of strategy of keep all possible options open. The upside play, to Saurabh's point, is you set the expectations so low that if you can form a sentence, it's a victory. The other aspect, though, is maybe you really don't want to put him up on the stage against a Donald Trump down the road. And so you're reserving this option and you're floating it out there as a trial balloon and sort of shifting the Overton window of acceptability now. So I always think that Democrats are going to do whatever is the most flexible, whatever gives them the most optionality, and whatever they perceive to be ruthlessly in their own self-interest. And I think this is a part of that same general strategy.
And there would certainly be a debate over the rules if there were a debate. Last time they argued over earpieces, drug tests, breaks, and COVID deaths, among other things. But let's go ahead and move over to Saurabh, who is going to walk us through the counterattacks on Bill Ackman, who was pivotal in getting Claudine Gay removed from the Harvard president position.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amber. So this week, I wanted to talk a little bit about the ongoing saga between Bill Ackman and a whole set of investors and donors to Harvard, as well as the university and the broader credentialed class that it represents. For those of you who haven't been following this super closely, Bill Ackman is this hedge fund owner who actually got very famous and very wealthy for taking aggressive short positions over the years, especially against Herbalife, when he accused them of being a multi-level marketing scheme and got the feds involved. It's a whole mess, and he's become fabulously wealthy off of it. Anyway, Bill Ackman led in many ways the campaign against Claudine Gay, who was the recently deposed member, the Harvard faculty member, formerly the president of Harvard College. And he won, and he intends on basically continuing that pressure. He's made it very clear that Claudine Gay's retirement wasn't everything that he wanted. He wants to see real substantive changes at the university. A couple of days after this happened, Claudine Gay resigning, he actually got an attack back from the media. Business Insider published a piece not about him, but about his wife, Neri Oxman, who's a professor at MIT. She's an Israeli who, kind of does stuff at the nexus of art and architecture. Some of her work has been funded by Jeffrey Epstein, though she contends that she didn't really know Jeffrey Epstein at all. There's a lot of layers to this story, and I want to take the 10,000-foot view. But this Business Insider article did sort of deep reading of Neri Oxman's scholarship and found, albeit less intense, but examples of plagiarism of her own in that piece. And so it started this escalation between Ackman and the media. The parent company of Business Insider, which published this attack piece, has said that they're engaging in a review of that journalism to see if it might violate journalistic standards. We'll see what comes out of that. But more broadly, I think that this is a good rest stop for us to see how the elite response to October 7th attacks in Israel is going. And I think that this has been a radicalization point for a lot of elite, especially sort of Jewish donor types in American life, but people more broadly. And I think it's good in a sense for right-wing interests that someone like Bill Ackman is actually experiencing what Darren Beattie calls the pain box, what it means to actually be in the arena going against the credentialed class in American life. He's seeing that these people are absolutely ruthless, that they aren't actually principled at all, that many of the so-called, pillar institutions in American life that he had relied on and sort of been comfortable with their prestige value in American life are actually political hatchet men. For ordinary citizens, there's a refrain that may or may not actually be true, that you commit 3 felonies a day just because the federal code is so long and arduous. And I think for some of these elites in American life, they're realizing that they might have 3 points of exposure that the press could come after them for on any given day as well. And it's I think a good thing that someone like Ackman is realizing just how unfair, just how vicious that the media can be, because next time someone like him, who's a busy guy, all these wealthy people are, looks at a media narrative in public life, they're going to give it a slightly more critical eye. Another element of this that I think is worth pointing out is the way that these institutions in some way are causing this to occur to themselves, because they insist on ideologizing these people's children. Bill Ackman's daughter, there's a Facebook post floating around, came back from attending Harvard and was a self-proclaimed Marxist. And she even sort of self-referentially said, did the most cliched thing ever, went to Harvard and became a Marxist. Another person at the highest echelons of American life, Elon Musk, has experienced something very similar, where I believe one of his daughters has been very aggressively lobbied for transgender therapy. These leaders in American life, they're quickly becoming more and more aware of just how intense the ideologization of their institutions, especially institutions interested in their children, are. And then you combine that with what they're seeing with the media. I think that it creates an opportunity where conservatives and center-right forces more broadly can appropriately, on an appropriate timeline, sort of wrap their arms around them in the coming years. It does not mean being a cheap date. It doesn't mean that, Bill Ackman should be honored at CPAC for being a great conservative champion. His foundation, the Pershing Square Foundation, as was rightfully pointed out by wonderful Twitter anon Peachy Keenan, has donated hundreds of millions of dollars to far-left causes over the years. And kudos to Ackman, he actually engaged on that thread, and who knows, maybe he's taking a second look at his philanthropy. So the right shouldn't necessarily be a cheap date for these folks, but there are encouraging signs that people are starting to wake up to a lot of the narratives that they have been fed over the last several decades by the institutional left in the United States. Just a final thread that's interesting, both Elon Musk and others have suddenly become very comfortable saying what, a year and a half ago would have been considered beyond the pale great replacement theory, noticing that the mass migration that the Biden administration has presided over might be used for political purposes to turn states like Texas blue. So I think that the sands are constantly shifting on what's going on in these extraordinarily wealthy people's imaginations and lives, and we should be very grateful that Elon Musk bought X, because it's allowed these narratives to propagate more easily. Who knows where it will end up going, but I think that it portends well that they are experiencing some of the worst of what conservatives experience in day-to-day American life, even though they've been in these rarefied liberal circles for so long.
Yeah, I mean, I think the phrase "don't be a cheap date," but then the whole of Saurabh's comments is exactly where I am, because yes, I mean, on the other hand, there is this conservative tick to just, as soon as anybody with, wealth, power, celebrity says a single potentially anti-left, not even conservative, but anti-left thing. You're like, yeah, let's make him president, tomorrow. Let's make him our presidential candidate. I'm not even talking about Donald Trump here. I'm talking about like, Caitlyn Jenner. Okay. So on the one hand, that's bad, right? And we shouldn't engage in that. On the other hand, I think there has been an unjustifiable level of cynicism around this. If you look at a lot of what Bill Ackman has been tweeting, has been saying, it really starts to look like an accelerated process of realizing the depths of, as you say, Saurabh, the ideological capture of American institutions. And people say, well, how come you didn't see that 20 years ago? The rest of us could, right? Look, these guys are busy. I'm sure they know that everybody knew that Harvard was liberal. Okay. But there were a lot of busy, powerful people in the world who were basically like, yeah, that's the toll you pay. Just like in business, DEI might be the business expense that I write off because it's what good people do. They don't really have time to look into this in more depth. They don't have an interest in looking into it until it just starts to directly affect them or their bottom line in a more significant way. And I said a few weeks ago, on this podcast that I think this has the potential to turn into a kind of, moment the way that we saw for K-12 during 2020 and 2021, where a lot of apolitical, very normie type parents realized two things. One, the education system doesn't prioritize the needs of their children whatsoever. And two, the content their children are learning the content their children are engaging with is much more radical than they ever thought that it would be, or thought that it was when they were just kind of checking in once every so often on homework. I think there is the potential for a moment here, and that the right should not ignore, for that realization that higher ed is and especially elite universities are as corrupt, are as ideologically captured as they are and have been for decades, for that piece of knowledge to go completely mainstream. And that could really change the landscape in a way that could only be good for the right for a variety of reasons. So I just would encourage people not to be overly cynical about, because it really, I mean, Bill Ackman, his responses to Peachy and to others have been a real reconsideration. I mean, he said he read Christopher Rufo's book and took notes, right, about the culture war and the sort of cultural revolutionaries in America. I think we shouldn't be so afraid of being a cheap date that we fail to take a W or recognize a W that might actually be significant and important.
Yeah, I mean, a cheap date's still a free meal, right? But I find myself feeling a little disheartened that sometimes all it takes for a massive shift to happen in the way we view these issues that conservatives have been fighting on for years, if not decades, is one rich person like growing a conscience. I mean, that is really annoying. But at the same time, in a world where you have people like Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates and all of these very influential left-leaning, wealthy, powerful people, I think we can't be afraid to say, okay, if one person is aligned with us, at least on this issue, let's accept them, let's welcome them with open arms and allow them to sort of take the charge. Because ultimately, Bill Ackman's biggest strength in this, I think, is that not only does he have institutional legitimacy, but he's also pretty much uncancelable, which makes him a very powerful and useful ally in this fight.
I've been heartened by the entire evolution that we've seen before our very eyes in Bill Ackman, because it may augur the idea that there could be others like him. And to the extent there is a safe space, so to speak, created for elites to exit the DEI regime and actually become its most formidable opponents, that would obviously be a massive achievement. And maybe the most important thing in Ackman's evolution is that he's put out the fact that the Jew hatred, which kind of spurred this whole first congressional testimony and hearing, and then the backlash against it, and then the deep dive into the plagiarism allegations for Claudine Gay, and ultimately her ouster or resignation, is that the Jew hatred is a byproduct of a DEI regime, which ultimately pits oppress versus oppressors and seeks the destruction of the Judeo-Christian West at the end of the day. And it's not just me saying that, it's someone like a Bill Ackman saying that. That is valuable. That may well create a safe space for others to dissent from the regime. The last point that I'll make really quickly is that it's very notable that the inclination, the almost reflexive response is for Harvard, Claudine Gay, and then the likes of Business Insider and others to attack those who are challenging these institutions and individuals on the merits. Their response is immediately to attack the critics. It's not to actually defend the regime that is in the dock, so to speak, right now. And I think that speaks to a real weakness of the position of the DEI regime and a defensive posture hidden under this offensive effort to smear and attack everyone from a Bill Ackman to a Chris Rufo. And with that, it's kind of a perfect transition to my segment, which is about another regime that attacks its critics, arguably in cruel and unusual ways, certainly underhanded ones for that matter. And this sort of theme for me derived from a story that I was working on, a sort of part profile, part commentary on the work of Empower Oversight, which is an organization spearheaded and led largely by a couple of former Chuck Grassley staffers on the Senate Judiciary Committee who left and are using their institutional knowledge and experience to go about representing the likes of a number of prominent whistleblowers for this Congress, including one of the two IRS whistleblowers, Gary Shapley, pivotal to the impeachment inquiry into Joe Biden, and who essentially ended up pushing the revelations, which forced the sham plea deal that the DOJ cooked up with Hunter Biden's team, which collapsed and then led to his prosecution in a couple of different venues. And also several of the FBI whistleblowers who have alleged a whole raft of corruption and weaponization within the FBI. The founder of Empower Oversight, Jason Foster, himself has become the subject of a recent story. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, which is kind of narrow and small, but also representative of a much bigger cancer at the core of our administrative state. And that is that Foster, while he was serving on the Senate Judiciary Committee as a staffer, a chief investigator on that committee during the most intense days of the unfolding Russiagate/Spygate conspiracy in 2017, 2018, he himself and a number of staffers faced the subpoena of their communications records, and not just basic information about phone numbers associated with them, but also call logs and text message logs as well. And it turns out that Foster himself found out about this by way of being notified by Google that Google had been served subpoenas for these records back in 2017 and covering records from late 2016 through mid 2017. Why did Foster only find out about this years later? Well, the Justice Department itself had gone to judges and secured non-disclosure orders, 5 of them, each 1 year long, preventing the likes of Google and other communications companies from telling the congressional staffers on several committees, not just Senate Judiciary, but it also appears the House Intelligence Committee and others, that staffers had their records subpoenaed. So they were kept in the dark about the fact that DOJ was snooping on them. Why was DOJ snooping on them and collecting these records? Well, it's sort of been implied that this stems from an investigation into a leak that some might recall of a Carter Page FISA warrant and subsequent applications to re-up those warrants. There was a leak that's been investigated. There's never been a leaker found. One person was prosecuted. One Senate staffer was prosecuted for not being honest with FBI agents around the leak of unclassified material that was private, but not actually the Carter Page FISA warrants. So this has been sort of the predicate for it that's been out there, sort of the explanation for why these staffers were being spied upon, essentially a leak investigation. But by the same token, there were any number of other issues being probed by the likes of the Senate Judiciary Committee, looking at the DOJ in regard to Russiagate/Spygate. For example, Michael Flynn's call with his Russian counterpart during the transition period, And then the subsequent effort to railroad Michael Flynn and paint him as a Russian agent, essentially, or colluding with the Russians, and the leak of the phone call that he had with the Russian ambassador, on top of the Carter Page FISA warrant, and then on top of other aspects of Russiagate/Spygate that were being probed by congressional staffers during this time period. So this has the looks of a spying effort for DOJ to snoop on investigators, and it may well have been a fishing expedition. The Department of Justice Inspector General is looking into why people were spied upon. Kash Patel, it should be noted, has also said that he received a similar subpoena. He would later be threatened, according to reports, by, at the time, senior DOJ official Rod Rosenstein, threatened that his records would be subpoenaed because of his digging into DOJ/FBI treachery around Russiagate/Spygate. He was threatened, actually, and then subsequently, of course, we had the infamous or famous Nunes memo, which revealed the Carter Page FISA warrants deficiencies. And Kash Patel himself was a key author of that. So all of which is to say, we're still learning today, years later, about corruption regarding Russiagate/Spygate. In this case, the DOJ going after its own probers. We'll see if the DOJ Inspector General or the House Judiciary Committee, which is also probing this, actually gets to the bottom of it. There have been records requests from House Judiciary Committee to understand why is it that the DOJ was spying on staffers doing their job in conducting oversight of DOJ during this 2017 largely time period. But what's amazing are a couple of things. One, how desensitized at this point we've become to all this. Two, at this point, probably the expectation we'd all have that anyone who's doing any sort of serious probing of the federal government within the federal government themselves is liable to be targeted. And once again, that they kept this hidden, that they had these non-disclosure orders for 5 years. So none of these staffers could know what had transpired when, according to Jason Foster and Empower Oversight, there's no legitimate basis for these non-disclosure orders to have been issued, keeping this secret and keeping those who were spied upon in the dark for years. It's so rotten and corrupted. And in another time period, maybe this would be a front page story. Now it's like one of a million examples that we can find of this sort of corruption and seeming weaponization here. And I think it just speaks to just how broad and deep the corruption is. Again, how desensitized we become to this. And also the fact that in contrast with, say, the Claudine Gay situation, for example, there a head rolled. You can point to a tangible victory against corrupt and weaponized, now as we see, forces, weaponized in the Harvard case because Harvard itself went after, for example, the New York Post when it was probing the plagiarism stories in the first place. There is a tangible victory that can be pointed to there, and maybe that will have a deterrent effect down the road, or maybe it will accelerate heads rolling elsewhere. We've never had that within the federal government. The deep state essentially always wins and never loses, even when its corruption is exposed. Still, you can't point to tangible victories. Until there's a tangible victory, there is no deterrent, and you can expect massive corruption and weaponization at scales as yet unseen to occur going forward, because there's never been a reckoning with or a grappling with the past. So with that, I kind of open up to the group for your impressions about this story and some of the broader themes that it brings to light.
Yeah, I think it definitely helps to illuminate just how, as you said, deep the corruption goes in terms of the deep state's targeting of anyone who would threaten its power. And it is amazing that it's been so many years since we first learned of Crossfire Hurricanes and its very sketchy origins. And yet we're still really uncovering just how insanely corrupt and disgusting and craven that effort to take down a sitting president, elected president was. And with that, I'll let it go to Inez.
Yeah, I mean, what's really irritating about all of this is how much it's still treated as fringe by the mainstream, which is a testament to the continuing power of the media. I mean, these are all things that are corroborated out in the public. Nothing that Ben said is reliant even on speculation, even if it were justified speculation. These are documents that are in the public. They are like corroborated reports, et cetera, et cetera. But it's really hard to break through, in part because of the complexity of it at this point. But it's really, really hard to break through when you start talking about this stuff. I think to normal middle of the road people, they assume that it's just like sort of wild and conspiratorial, when in fact It's very well documented, very open. I mean, there's all kinds of speculation that I think we're very clear here on this podcast that when we do engage in something that we suspect but we don't know, but this is not one of those things, which makes it an extremely frustrating testament to the enduring power of the mainstream media, I think. With that, with Saurabh's permission, we're going to go ahead and transition for time purposes. So the subject that I wanted to bring up today for the podcast is the saga of the William Penn statue in Philadelphia, the latest in, of course, this iconoclastic sort of regime changey movement to drag down the statues associated with any part of American history that once made us feel proud about ourselves. And I think this is notable for a couple reasons. The first being, again, I don't know why. I mean, I guess I'm on an optimistic kick these last few weeks, but one of the notable things about it being that this is a win. This statue is the end of the saga is so far that this statue is going to remain up. So this began with the National Park Service putting out a bulletin saying that the statue in front of William Penn's house in Pennsylvania was going to be removed for inclusion purposes. They did not elaborate. They didn't even bother giving an explanation. And I think that in itself is worth noting because it was just assumed within the circles. And I do think this probably has to do with some, younger, woker staffers in the National Park Service and the Biden administration. They didn't even think this would be an issue, right? They thought that they could just give this very generic explanation and that there really wouldn't be much pushback against it. And I think in part the reason they had that impression is because very early on, and here I want to give credit to my husband, Jarrett Stepman, who not only has written this book about the war on history, about the statue's issue, but I think it's a condemnation of the Republican Party and of the right that it took them this long to realize the very simple fact that it was never about Robert E. Lee or the Confederacy or debates about the American Civil War. It was always about dragging down symbols of America, full stop. And way too many Republicans took way too long to realize that. And then over each figure, they would sort of debate and amongst themselves, like, is it right that we have a statue of Robert E. Lee, right? And just completely missing the point, which is that none of the people who are demanding the removal of these statues made any difference between, Thomas Jefferson and Robert E. Lee, right? A fact that Trump pointed out pretty early as well and was mocked for. So that's where we are now. There does seem to have been a tipping point. There was a huge pushback against removing this statue, not only from Republicans and from Republicans in Pennsylvania, of course, Pennsylvania, named after William Penn. So not only on the facts, which in this particular case, William Penn was famously tolerant of the native tribes within the region of Pennsylvania, instituted the so-called Long Peace with the tribes there. So even less reason than usual. But I do think this is sort of a turning point where everyone realized this is not about, let's not have this long and elaborate debate about who William Penn was, what his legacy is. No, this symbolizes something, and preventing it from happening is also a symbol. So there was enormous pushback, including from Democrats, which I think, again, is an indication of the winds shifting. You have Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, actually pushing back against the Biden administration on this and expressing his support for the statue, and then tweeted out how glad he is that it's going to remain where it is. I think all of these things are indications that there might be a tipping point on this for two reasons. One, some part of the right, at least some substantial part of the right, actually growing some kind of backbone and fighting back against some of these iconoclastic pushes and realizing the importance of the symbolism involved. I mean, too little, too late, but still better than no little, too late, or no little, too late. I don't know. And then two, the fact that I think, again, that realization is not limited to Republicans. I think related to the Bill Ackman segment that we were talking about, I do think that there's the most optimistic thing I can say at the opening of 2024, which is likely to be incredibly consequential, not just for the election purposes, but for all of the trends we're always talking about on this podcast, right? So I think one of the few reasons for optimism looking into this year is I do finally get this deep sense I have data points as I have the last few weeks laid them out why in specifics, but it's also just I guess a vibe shift sensation that there actually are going to be two sides joined on a lot of these battles, which is an improvement. I get the most pessimistic about this country's future when it feels like there's not even any kind of organized opposition to what the left is doing. I think that's going to be less and less true, and I hope to bring you more and more examples of that. I do think that having a spine, understanding the depths of the problem is a more mainstream way to look at the world than it was even a year ago or 2 years ago. And look, that gives us the best chance on the statues issue and many others. So with that, I'll kick it out to the group. If you have anything to add about the statue itself, the particulars of this battle, juxtaposing it with the lost battle in Arlington over the Confederate Reconciliation Monument, the sort of melting of Robert E. Lee in a very violent sort of public way. Anyway, any of those, or just simply the aesthetic victory of keeping up what is a beautiful statue, which I realize is probably not the most important part of any of this, but is a real tragedy, especially for places like the city of Charlottesville that used to have these beautiful works of art, including of Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea. Just horrible to see those torn down. Like it really does, again, give a sense of regime change, of living under a tyrannical and iconoclastic state.
Yeah, I think that this is an unadulterated victory. It's very good. It might be, and you would know much better than I, Inez, the most clear example of actually stopping one of these things, not just creating an outrage around it. I do think for a variety of reasons, it was a slightly easier fight than some of the other statue controversies that have happened over the last few years. And so you can take the optimistic angle on it, which is that this is building muscle memory to do this in more cases, or you can take the pessimistic case, which is that this was an easy case and conservatives are still, wet noodles about this sort of thing. I wanted to also shout out your husband's work. He's one of the few mainstream conservative commentators that is unapologetic. Doesn't matter what the statue is, and actually defending American history, good, bad, and the ugly. And so it's extremely important. I also think that in terms of mentality, this is a useful example, because I don't think that if we were using left-wing moral scrutiny on William Penn, that he would have necessarily survived this Inquisition. Anyone in American history up until 3.5 weeks ago is suspect under the left's moral revolutionary code. And so the approach that the right needs to have, whether it's a Confederate Reconciliation Monument or a statue of William Penn or a statue of Theodore Roosevelt or a statue of Thomas Jefferson, is the same, which is F you, no, you don't get to tear down American history. That is, these people can be given no quarter. What is starting with Robert E. Lee today will be Abraham Lincoln tomorrow, will be, General Eisenhower 10 years later. It doesn't matter. The left is very clear that there is no principle operating here. There is only an order of operations. And so if you'd like the Thomas Jefferson statue to stay up, there needs to be 10 Robert E. Lee statues standing in the way to prevent them from getting to that stage. So great victory. And I hope that the right's becoming more comfortable defending this kind of stuff. And this would, as you said, be a good litmus test for someone like Bill Ackman. Next time that there's a Confederate War Memorial that the left wants to take down, it'd be nice to see some of these anti-woke types speaking up about it, because it's a great example of the kind of thing that stands in the breach behind the kind of social revolutions that they might be comfortable with and the kind of social revolutions that they are less comfortable with.
I think you've both nailed it. And it's a great reminder, this victory is, that if you're explaining, you're losing. And it also just reminds me of this common trap that the right falls into, which is what I call the condemnation trap, where the left immediately sets the parameters of what's acceptable and what's morally just or morally right. And the right feels the need to play the game of, well, I don't support that one, but let's discuss the broader principle. And they've immediately set themselves up on the defensive and in the losing position. This is exactly what they did with the Robert E. Lee statue, where you had these weak-kneed Republicans pillorying Trump because he said that there could possibly be very fine people who were marching in order to defend the Robert E. Lee statue, which was separate from the white supremacist protests that took place in Charlottesville. And then when we saw the Robert E. Lee statue being melted in this dark, disturbing way, marked by the Washington Post there with video cameras, even though this was supposed to be done secretly. I think that was a tipping point for many to see the symbolism of the almost demonic aesthetic of what they're doing to American history. That symbolism, I think, was a wake-up call for many.
I concur in all these remarks. The statue issue as a general matter is kind of the ultimate slippery slope. I've said before, by Democrat standards, Martin Luther King Jr. Commemorations will be toppled to the extent the anti-cultural revolution continues apace. So anything that stops it is a plus. Statues stand or the country ultimately falls. Or at least directionally, that's the way we would go here. So any stand and victory here is a positive one. The only slight, kind of cautionary point that I would make is it's interesting that this sanity prevailed in Pennsylvania, just like we've seen sanity and cogency, frankly, prevail over State Senator John Fetterman, one of the two senators of the state. It's an election year, obviously. And so I would caution that any appearances of Democrat moderation may be purely tactical and political. But that said, we should still celebrate the W's when we rack them up and look for lessons to be taken from them and hold them up and secure future W's after that.
We're going to go ahead and move into our final thoughts, and we will start with Saurabh, as he is a very busy young man, as we all know.
Thank you, Amber. I just wanted to tap on this point again about the statues. I think it's such a great litmus test issue for whether or not someone is useful at all to the right and therefore consequentially useful to the country. I don't know if we had talked about the Robert E. Lee statue melting when it had happened on NatCon Squad, but it is a very good reminder of what exactly undergirds the mentality of these cultural revolutionaries. I want to parallelize it to something going on in Europe, where you're starting to see Islamic activists speak much more openly. They're like, well, this is revenge for colonialism. That's why we're taking over your countries. And it's like, oh, okay, you scratch just the thinnest coat of paint on the outside of this, and you realize that there's sort of deep ethnic, racial, cultural grievance that undergirds a lot of this. It's not about building an American story we can all be proud of. It's a revenge fantasy by fetishists. That's why they gratuitously decided to melt down the statue and take a video of it. They see it as the, euthanization of the old America and the birthing of a new one. And Republicans, conservatives, sane people of all stripes have every right to tell them that they can go screw off and that they have no right to, create a new America that no one asked for through their, low stakes cultural warfare that they engage on, poking and prodding at every single cultural touchstone in American life from coast to coast, day by day. It needs to be total war on these people, stopping their encroaching march. And so again, great victory had today.
I really felt like watching that Robert E. Lee melting was like watching him die again. I really can't overstate how radicalizing of a moment it was. But since we didn't talk a whole lot about the GOP primary on this episode, I will quickly run through the latest foibles from the Nikki Haley campaign. She, of course, is betting it all on New Hampshire, which has a large group of independents that she thinks will swing for her. But the latest polls that have come out this week have suggested that her catapulting into second place, her momentum is starting to wane, starting to fall. She is still down about 20 percentage points to the former president, Donald Trump. She has had several campaign trail gaffes, which is, I guess, semi-unusual for her in that she's very tightly PR controlled, where she insulted Iowans on two separate bases. Both said that New Hampshire had to correct Iowans' vote in the caucuses, and then also said that she has to change personalities when she goes from Iowa to New Hampshire. Of course, she caught heat for her comments about the Civil War and whether or not slavery was one of the impetuses for that. And I think her latest week of disaster is a reminder of how weak of a candidate she always has been. And her so-called momentum was entirely fabricated by the GOP establishment donor class, as well as some anti-Trump Democratic donors as well. And seeing her immediately fumble the bag, so to speak, should be, I think, a welcome sign to those of us who are rightly concerned about her interventionist foreign policy and her complete lack of ability to understand the moment that conservatives are in this country, and continually focus on some of the sillier battles on random tax policy and other parts of her campaign that seem completely out of touch.
Yeah, I wanted to briefly note two things in my final thoughts. One is this case that Elon Musk is bringing against the administrative state, against the NLRB, which I think may actually turn out to be quite important, especially given the court's seeming restructuring of the powers of the administrative state piece by piece, narrowing precedents like Chevron, right? In this case, you have administrative law judges, ALJs, who are extremely difficult to remove and have extraordinary independence. And in the case of Elon Musk, he's being charged with retaliatory behavior towards employees that have criticized him. Let's not forget that the National Labor Relations Board is also the one that came after the Federalists and producer owner Ben Domenech then at the time for making a joke on Twitter about sending his employees to the salt mines. And that turned into a very real free speech and labor relations case. So this is an independent agency that is very much out of control, that is very much judge, jury, and executioner of the laws that it supposedly administers. And so this case actually challenges the constitutionality of having these kinds of judges who are totally isolated. They can only be removed in very, very limited circumstances, who aren't, appointed through the Article 3 process. They're not they're not Article 3 judges. They're not. So Elon Musk here is actually just asking for his right to trial by jury, to actually be tried in a federal court under federal rules. And he's being denied that and being given an administrative quote unquote trial that has very, very different standards of innocence and different abilities to defend himself. So I think this actually not only is important because, of course, they are coming after, just like they're coming after Bill Ackman before that, and continuing, they are coming after Elon Musk. There was a time where we would be horrified to imagine that, private citizens speaking out aggressively against the current political establishment would have meant that automatically they would go through investigations of their business. This is just another thing that we accept in 2024 in America, that we anticipate, and in fact don't imagine that anyone can challenge the regime without going through this kind of process. But this particular case, I think, is worth keeping an eye on. And the second brief thing is the arrest of hundreds of people in Manhattan for shutting down simultaneously the Holland Tunnel, Manhattan Bridge, and Brooklyn Bridge, which brought traffic to a standstill in the city, produced some viral videos, but is once again, in this case, yes, they arrested these people, and thank you to the NYPD for doing that. But highlights two things. One, the problem of actually having DAs in there who won't charge. We'll see how many of these protesters are actually charged with anything substantial, right? Arresting them is nice, but they've broken a myriad of laws. I mean, the protesters here have launched balloons into JFK airport airspace. I don't know if people were paying attention, but there were simultaneous protesters. These are, I should know, allegedly pro-Palestine protesters and anti-Israel protests. But at this point, it seems pretty clear that my prediction from 4 or 5 weeks ago that this would turn into a broader BLM style moment for the left appears to be true. It seems almost disjointed at this point from what's actually happening in Gaza, and seems more domestically focused. But they tried to shut down, they fortunately didn't succeed, but tried to simultaneously shut down JFK airport and LAX airport, which would have completely screwed US airspace and probably hundreds of thousands of travelers throughout the country. These are incredibly antisocial and illegal acts. We'll see what comes of these arrests, if there will be any real consequences, but highlights once again that disorder, just like in 2020, depending on which side the disorder is coming from. If you're a J6er who rioted in the Capitol, you stayed in pretrial detention without any ability to exercise your rights as a U.S. citizen, to speedy trial and all the rest of it, for years before even going to trial and receiving your sentence, right? If you were a rioter in 2020, or you are one of these protesters who is illegally shutting down very consequential travel, and it's only a matter of time before somebody dies, right, in one of these protests, whether it's from one of the protesters themselves, from somebody who takes matters into their own hands because law and order has been abandoned, or it's somebody who's stuck in traffic who is in a ambulance and needs to get to the hospital, for example. I mean, when you're talking about stopping hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, some percentage of them, it won't just be an inconvenience, it'll be a disaster or very dangerous to stop. So, it's only a matter of time before this gets much uglier. We can expect it to continue, I think, basically every weekend at this point. It's kind of one of these funny things that doesn't get, I don't think, the mainstream coverage that it deserves, but is very clearly the left, the street left, so to speak, asserting itself and its ability to anything from inconvenience to endanger everyone around them.
And I think that'll probably be a part of the 2024 campaign, just like it was a part of the 2020 campaign, even if Democrats were loath to admit it. And worth noting, by the way, while we were recording, I think the sentencing came down for the notorious Ray Epps, who gets 1 year probation, in stark contrast to how other J6ers were treated. Also, the DC U.S. attorney, I think on the anniversary of J6 or a day before, said that they would be pursuing 1,000 or more additional prosecutions. And this is of people who are even at further removed from violent actions at the Capitol or massive property destruction at the Capitol. So the contrast remains incredibly stark, and the two-tier justice system has been sustained and continues to be sustained. On another aspect of, I think, 2024 chicanery that we can expect, one thing that I've been looking for is, how is the censorship regime going to operate this year? The censorship regime has obviously gotten scrutiny over the last 4 years that it had never been subjected to previously. Obviously, there's a massive Supreme Court case that's going to come, unfortunately, late in the election, where we'll find out what the limits are for government colluding and coordinating with social media companies to silence wrong thinkers and chill wrong thinkers. I saw today there's a headline, or in recent days, a headline that Rumble, a YouTube alternative, which of course hosts conservatives and other dissenting viewpoints, is actually subject to an active and ongoing investigation by the SEC. The details of that investigation are scant, but obviously worth noting. Substack as well, there's been a whisper campaign, even more than a whisper campaign, trying to accuse Substack of platforming and essentially supporting Nazis, and a massive backlash against Substack. And then, of course, obviously, there's been the continued withering assault waged, leveled against Elon Musk and X. And I think the question is going to be, what is the censorship regime going to look like in 2024? I think, personally, there's going to be a concerted effort to try and nuke X in toto, in defense of democracy, of course. But presumably, the censorship regime will be far more pervasive for any and all platforms that are not already totally cowed or really captured, essentially, by the administrative state. And I'm thinking there of the likes of Meta and others. What will the censorship regime look like? What tactics will it use this time? Look for, I think, the nuking or attempted nuking, or at least draining the resources of and harassing any and all platforms of any size that permit the dissemination of dissenting views. You've got Trump himself gagged in at least one case. You have the censorship regime that already still persists in the non-X/Rumble/Substack space. What happens to X, Rumble, Substack, and others this year? It's something that we ought to be keeping a very close eye on, and there ought to be offensive measures taken. And the argument should be put forth why these platforms need to be defended right now, because you can be sure that they're going to be attacked, which is really going to be attacked on millions of dissenting viewpoints and millions of dissenting Americans in this election year.
And that's going to do it for us this week. On behalf of Inez, Ben, and Saurabh, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Amber Duke, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.